This is a Sony Blu-ray player, model number BDP-S300. I assume the BDP stands for Blu-ray disc player. I found this at a local Goodwill store for about $5. I've found quite a few of these over the years, about a dozen or so. In almost all cases, the Blu-ray player software was out of date. And when the software is out of date, the Blu-ray player will have trouble playing certain discs. It'll lock up and freeze or refuse to play certain discs altogether. And the fix is usually to install the current firmware. And that was true with this one as well. Now, this is a very early Blu-ray player. This Blu-ray player was made in 2007, and that is really the first year that Blu-ray players hit the market. This is a very high-end Blu-ray player for its time period. This thing is huge. I mean, it's gigantic. It's kind of hard to convey the real size of this thing. For comparison, here's a more modern Blu-ray player. This is a little Samsung. It was made in 2015. You can just see the difference in size. It's tiny by comparison. Changing the view and looking at it from above, you can appreciate just how big this thing really is. And here's our more modern Samsung Blu-ray player. What a difference in size. On the back of this thing, you see it has quite an array of outputs. Again, this was a high-end system. It was designed to drive, a high-quality stereo sound system. It has a composite video output. So this device was designed to be used with an old-fashioned analog television set. And it also has simple analog RCA sound outputs as well. So back in 2007, if you were still using your old analog television set, you could play your Blu-rays using the video output, although that kind of defeats the purpose of a Blu-ray, doesn't it? But it also has a component output. Now, this is a high-resolution output. It was also kind of a flash in the pan. This was a technology standard that didn't really have a long life. And, of course, it has the obligatory HDMI output, which is a much more robust and long-lived standard. So all devices now have HDMI outputs. The component outputs are rarely seen anymore. Now, as far as the sound goes, again, we have the two simple analog right and left speaker outputs, but we also have this much more sophisticated 5.1 output, which drives 6 speakers, 2 front, 2 back, center, and a woofer. So again, this was designed for really a home entertainment system. Now, what this device doesn't have is either an Ethernet output, that would be an RJ45 plug, or a USB thumb drive port. Any modern Blu-ray player is going to have a USB port, and it's going to have either a wired or a wireless Ethernet connector or both. When I get a hold of one of these old devices, the first thing I do is I look for a manual, and there's almost always one available online. So if we simply go to the Sony website, we can find their online manual for our BPD-S300. Very complete, tells you everything you need to know. The other thing I search for is a firmware update. It has been my experience that in these devices, the firmware is almost always out of date and the device is having trouble playing certain discs. And I assume that that's the reason why a perfectly good Blu-ray player ended up at a Goodwill store or a garage sale or sometimes a dumpster dive find. All you need to do to fix the problem typically is install the latest version of the firmware. And you will have a Blu-ray player that plays just like a new one. If you search for the current firmware version of the Sony BDP-S300, you come to this page, and it's a rather detailed explanation. One of the things it tells us is that the current version is 6.20, and so that's what you need to install to get your system running properly. So if you have a version with a number lower than that, then you need to update to version 6.2. Now, in every other Blu-ray player that I've encountered, you could update the firmware either using the Ethernet connector or by downloading the firmware onto a thumb drive and installing the thumb drive into your Blu-ray player, and you can update it that way. Now, because this early Sony Blu-ray player has neither an Ethernet connection or a USB thumb drive port, you have to install the software using a CD. The instructions for creating this CD are rather involved. You download the firmware onto your computer, and then you burn that software onto a CD-R disk. They specifically recommend that you use a CD-R disk and not a CD-RW disk. Another important fact that they point out is when you are burning the CD disk, you use the burn image option. And when you are done, you want to be sure that the disk is finalized so that no further writing is possible. So to get the firmware update software, you go to the firmware update page and you click download, and you got a license agreement. You gotta scroll through all this, click download again, and it's going to ask you for a location of where you want to store it. And so you will go ahead and enter a location, and you will then store the software on your hard drive. What you download is this file right here. It's an exe file, or in other words, an executable. Double click it and launch that executable. And it's going to ask you where do you want to place the extracted file. I'm just going to place it back in this very same directory. And there it is. What it gives you is an ISO file. This is one way to contain multiple files inside of one file. And now we're going to put that software on a CD-R, a writable CD disk. Fortunately, when I found this Blu-ray player, the remote control accompanied it. And that's very lucky. I would say less than half the time I find a device like this that the remote control comes with it, but this time I was lucky. And this remote control has a lot of functionality. We're going to need the remote control in order to learn the current firmware that's installed. In case you need the remote control, its number is RMT-B101A. An aftermarket third-party version of this remote is available on Amazon, and you can also find used originals on eBay. And this is the first screen you see when you turn it on. We've connected our Sony Blu-ray player to a television set. This is the initial screen we get when we turn on the Blu-ray player. Now, how do we determine what version of software we're using? On your remote control, press the button that says System Menu, and then use the direction buttons to get down to Setup, and hit the Enter key. On Video Setup, hit the Enter key. Now we hit the Enter key again, and we go to the aspect ratio screen. Now on the remote control, there are 4 colored buttons, red, green, blue, and yellow. Click the blue button, and it will show you what version of software you're using. And it says we're using version 4.90. The current version is 6.20, so the software on this Blu-ray player needs to be updated. Now to create the firmware update CD, I'm going to use this program called IMG Burn. I want to write an image file to the disk. And now we are ready to burn the disk. We'll go ahead and put the CD into the Blu-ray player. When the process begins, the display will say disk DWLD, and then after a couple of minutes it will start flashing between WRT flash and download, and that'll sort of oscillate back and forth. You know you'll be getting near the end when it says WRT subcon, and then it'll finish off with DLOK. When it says DLOK, it means it finished successfully. It'll then eject the disk and turn off the power. The software updating is complete. We got the display saying DL OK, but it only displayed for a few seconds and then it went out. That was a bit confusing. I was under the impression DL OK would stay illuminated. It just went out completely, and so I wasn't sure if we were done or not. The disc tray opened up. Okay, so now we will turn on our Blu-ray player. It took about a minute to display. I'm not sure why. Now we will check our software version to be sure we got the right one installed. Again, we go to System menu. We click down to Setup. Enter, 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 and then blue button. And yes, we have successfully upgraded our Blu-ray player to software version 6.20. I'm pretty sure that version 6.2 is the final version of the software. I really doubt there'll be any versions beyond this one. I did test the Blu-ray player after installing the software, and it does indeed work better than it did before. Okay, thanks for watching.